The visual language within the Olympic legacy calls on graphic designers to have an incredible optimism. The designer must have a profound knowledge of the city and its people. When transforming this into a comprehensive visual identity for the games, the designer maintains a love of the good, an understanding of the bad, and most importantly, a willingness to take this knowledge and make it palatable to the global community who may hold a separate set of hostilities. The look of the games requires the illusion of objectivity, a front that is able to gloss over the political context without acknowledging its existence. It is not necessarily patriotism per se, rather a visual announcement of how the state relates to the division between Olympic legacy and myth. The graphic design for an Olympic Games therefore forms a facade that is constructed based on what is deemed appropriate for global viewing. However, the audience is only made aware of the existence of this facade when the front is fractured. The 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow failed to form a cohesive visual language, and although founded on political unity, the USSR presented a Games that appeared ungrounded and unsure of itself. Hindsight allows us to see that this fractured presentation may be the truest to the nation it was representing, as the 22nd Olympiad marked both the first complete welcoming of the wider global community onto the Union's turf, as well as the beginning of the state's own political closing ceremony. The legacy of the modern Olympiad upholds apoliticism as a central principle. However, due to its nomadic nature that operates at a global scale, this apolitical stance runs counter to the reality of the Games. Intrinsic to the function of the Olympics is a political context which can never be severed from reality. Instead, what is seen as the creation of specific graphic language by host states around this context, which attempts to numb pre-existing external tensions of the international political environment, presenting an idealized image of its author. Rule 53 of the 1980 Olympic Charter, issued by the International Olympic Committee, states that every kind of demonstration or propaganda, whether political, religious, or racial, is forbidden in Olympic areas. The specific wording of the Charter, narrowing the ban on propaganda to Olympic areas such as stadiums or the Olympic Village. This carries significant weight in determining what is permitted, as it ties political expression to the physical and implies showings by state athletes or coaches, creating a grey area to be filled by the visual identity put forward by host states. When creating the look of the Games, the host state must maintain a balance between upholding the Olympic values and expressing national culture and ideals, a balance that can see a blurring of the line between celebration and propaganda. In 1968, a group of students from Yale's architecture and design programs conducted a survey of Las Vegas's architecture through a semiotic lens in a resulting critique of modernism. What emerged 4 years later was Learning from Las Vegas, which offered a challenge for contemporary architects obsessed with the heroic and monumental. Under the heading Image of Las Vegas, Inclusion and Illusion in Architecture, Robert Venturi designates Las Vegas as pleasure zone. He continues, essential to the imagery of pleasure zone architecture are lightness, the quality of being an oasis in a perhaps hostile context, heightened symbolism, and the ability to engulf a visitor in a new role. While contextualizing these attributes to architecture within Learning from Las Vegas, Venturi's conceptual framework of the pleasure zone can be applied to the Olympic legacy when we consider the graphic language states adopt to present themselves devoid of aggression. Host cities undergo a tangible and symbolic overhaul in preparation for the Games, which sees pleasure zone characteristics forming an architecture facade rather than an architecture of structure. The success of the mobile pleasure zone varies between Games and can be measured by the ability to see through it, as the gaps or oddities in the visual language of this facade present pieces of a reality that may be at odds with the one declared by the state. The graphic design put forward by the Soviet Union for the 22nd Olympic Games presented a fractured front, highlighting the existence of the pleasure zone and the associated political subtext. For Moscow 1980's organizing committee, the challenge for the graphics was set: the selling of the Soviet Union's peaceful socialist way of life on the back of its invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. Despite the loosening of its closed border policies as a byproduct of the détente period, the hosting of an Olympic Games would be by far the largest international display the Soviet Union held in its brief history. As expressed by Jennifer Parks in Red Spot Red Tape, millions of foreign observers would see firsthand the level of development in Soviet society that in reality was far less modern than its Western rivals. This, paired with Soviet aggression in the Middle East, increased the importance of the Union's use of graphics to deal with the political context, as its actions were at odds with the image it was trying to project for the Games. If the problems of design are only adequately addressed if the subject is asked how it wants to manifest itself and present itself in the gaze of others, then this contradiction revealed a new issue internally. The graphics design for the 2-week period needed to depict the Union both as a friendly host and a geopolitical rival, a tension that the state was yet to adequately resolve. Illustrator Viktor Chizhkov's Misha the Bear was named the official mascot of the Games in 1978. Chizhkov's soft, friendly bear created a caricature of the vicious animal that had become a commonplace stereotype of the Russian region. In the official report of the 22nd Games, available to the public, Misha had only 3 authorized depictions. However, as his lovable character developed into a staple of Soviet pop culture, his figure was shaped for many different uses, often indiscriminately to a hollow effect. In the lead up to the Games, the sweeping use of Misha as a symbol of virtue was used in place of a critical design choice that may have been more considered. The reliance on Misha the Bear as a crutch was seized upon by critics of Moscow 1980's Olympic Games, as his image was manipulated in highly political critiques of the host state. In addition to the Carter administration's official boycott of the 22nd Games in late 1979, motivated by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, separate boycott coalitions had been forming in the 1970s, placing emphasis on human rights violations within the Union. Untitled by the France-based Moscow Olympics Boycott Committee, or SOBOM, is a distortion of a poster designed by Moscow-based Konstantin Rudov, titled "Welcome, Games of the 22nd Olympiad, Moscow 1980", published as a part of the official series of posters. This parody saw Misha donning a pair of shined jack boots and a holster, aligning his previously friendly demeanor with totalitarian imagery common to Nazi Germany and pointing to the oppressive nature of Soviet policies. Sobom mocked the organizing committee's mobilization of Misha in pursuit of apoliticism, and in doing so challenged how the warm character fails to uphold the pleasure zone if he is deployed as the sole symbol of goodwill. The relationship between politics and graphics mobilized within the pleasure zone can be better understood when comparing the 1936 Berlin and 1972 Munich Olympic Games. In 1966, Otto Eicher was appointed as the chief designer for the 20th Games. Applying Venturi's framework, Eicher was responsible for creating an oasis. However, in this case, the hostile context was one of history. Known now as the Nazi Olympics, the 1936 Berlin Games took place in an Olympic environment that was yet to specifically reject political displays within the event. This allowed the Berlin Organizing Committee to gently appropriate Olympic ideals to sell Nazi government's ideology. The revised charter for Munich 1972, this time including apoliticism as a grounding feature, required a visual identity that included a disavowal of previous political displays without explicitly bringing this subtext to the viewer's attention to remain in accordance with the Charter. ICA formulated a system for the posters that encouraged regulated variations of colour and form to sell the idea of a new globalist Germany. Each sporting event had a single poster, visually connected through the use of an unsparing filter over images of athletes. This effect worked to numb the image, presenting the classless humans devoid of any national features that could link them to a state or, by extension, an ideology, placing all on the same playing field to signal an approval of democratic ideals. The figures, by use of photography, are presented in motion, a sharp departure from the favoured static and monumental imagery seen in Berlin 1936. The applied filter favoured shades of blue, green and yellow, and rejected red or gold due to their use in Berlin 1936. Despite their popularity in Olympic Games design throughout the 1960s. This general and in some sense anonymous approach to Olympic design stood counter to the century-old design brief presented by the Games, as it suggested an intent to avoid drawing visual connections to the host state's cultural history. ICA's Citizen of the World presented Germany's modernization effort in universal terms, and his hazy and restrained approach advised the audience against a close reading of domestic conditions. With this considered, the selected graphic front of ambiguity may have been the best to represent Germany of the time, a global city whose policy now welcomed cultural diversity and had cast aside nationalism in favor of democracy. However, the oasis that ICA was building, seen in his application of generalities to separate the 1972 Games from Germany's historical context, was ultimately overtaken by the politically motivated violence that occurred on September 5, 1972. A terrorist attack by Palestinian group Black September killed 11 members of the Israeli Olympic team. It was motivated by the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as well as the International Olympic Committee's refusal to acknowledge Palestine as an autonomous state. Jewish blood was once again spilled on German soil, binding the new Germany to its history and undermining Munich 1972's visual rejection of it. The graphic language seen in service of the pleasure zone may successfully create a facade. However, as the Olympics can never be devoid of politics, the reality of the game's structure will show itself. In order to adhere to the champion stance of apoliticism in the Olympic legacy, host states create a graphic language that rejects external hostile context of global political conflicts. Due to the sheer scale of the Olympics, a political subtext is ever present and finds a home in the visual identity of the Games. Due to Moscow 1980's fractured visual presentation, this political subtext was capitalized on by critics and overtly politicized to mock the Soviet Union's efforts to create the image of a friendly Games, drawing attention to the existence of the created pleasure zone. Central to the characteristics of pleasure zone architecture is the notion of lightness. This showed itself in the Moscow 1980 Olympic Games through the adoption of the theme friendship and its varying interpretations, seen prominently in the official posters. Jeffrey Sellers, in Politics of Organizational Adornment, points to themes as signs, as symbolic vehicles through which organizations convey some meaning about themselves. Sellers explains that these are distinguished from other organizational signs by their semiotic thickness. Therefore, the embracement of a theme is a compilation of symbolism, a way to centralize the experience and dictate the graphics that reinforce it. The theming of Moscow 1980, paired with the softened visual language, attempted to create an all-encompassing atmosphere that did not challenge, rather invited the guest to enjoy the oasis in a perhaps hostile context. Moreover, the designation of friendship was one of the many answers to the challenge of cross-cultural communication. How could a visitor reject such a non-threatening olive branch? The posters designed by Soviet artists were the primary vehicle for projecting the chosen theme and lightness for the Moscow 22nd Games. Since the inception of the Games, Olympic posters have evolved to play a unique role in communication, differing from the traditional function of a poster to sell, to educate, to convince, or to appeal. Designers have delegated the carrying of practical information like ticket prices and event locations to other vehicles, such as programs and broadcasts. This distinction has allowed the posters to embrace symbolism over content and project more intangible messages, such as the chosen values and ideals of the Games, in a telling graphic shorthand. Furthermore, in the case of Moscow 1980, the presentation of the posters were relegated to exhibition spaces rather than existing in the public and therefore yielding to the varying environments of the city they were promoting. This context in which the posters were received was as carefully designed as the posters themselves. This was at odds with the conventional function of a poster, yet can be seen in keeping with the desire to create a singular perspective within the pleasure zone. As a way to generate interest in the Games, Moscow 1980's organizing committee held an international poster competition in 1979, which saw over 4,800 submissions from designers from over 45 different countries. The submissions to this competition presented a diverse and often conflicting understanding of the espoused friendship. For the Soviet designers, the graphic shorthand dictated by the theme remained tightly adhered to, whereas the international designers approached the task from a more literal and, on occasion, combative standpoint. The work of Moscow-born Lyudmila Semyonovna-Tarasova provides an extensive sampling of the use of symbols in Olympiada 80 posters and the ways in which they upheld lightness. Tarasova worked for Plakat Publishing House, the organization responsible for publishing all official posters for the Games, and was a member of the Union of Artists of the USSR. Considering that design is conjunctions of form and meaning based on the interest of the sign maker, Tarasova's catalogue of Olympic posters showed a view of the Games that may have been most closely aligned with how the Soviet Union wished to portray itself. In Like a Single Song, the words sound, Olympics and Moscow, Tarasova engaged with multiple different styles to create an anachronistic composition with lightness at the center. The layout follows a skewed axis, reminiscent of early 20th century Soviet constructivism. The poetic slogan, set in a modern sans serif typeface, appears out of place in comparison to Olympic poster trends of the time, where the role of uniting or inspiring was left up to pictorial elements. Luzhniki Stadium, modernized in preparation for the 22nd Games to be used as a central facility, floats on the page, a physical display tempered by a very literal portrayal of lightness. Tarasova withholds the Olympic rings and chooses instead to exhibit a colorful flag, depicted in an illustrative style that is commonly found in 1950s advertising. Tarasova and other Soviet designers engaged in Moscow 1980 relied on these kinds of illustrations to convey lightness in their works, as it softened the imagery by placing a lens on what was presented. The illustrations, although far from surreal, were used in place of photography and therefore avoided the objectivity that it often lends to compositions. In its place, we see cartoonish depictions of the familiar, which in some ways mirrors the idea of friendship in the Olympiad itself, a dramatization of something recognizable to ground the audience, yet pushed to the point where it feels contrived, empty, or light. In contrast, Italian designer Martino Gervini played with a more literal reduction, commonly seen in pictograms, to display the Olympic flame when symbolizing the Games in 22nd Giochi Olimpici Mosca 1980. In this abstracted form, the shapes appear reminiscent of an onion dome in the style of the Russian Orthodox Church, with the Olympic rings sitting at the highest point, a position often reserved for a cross. Despite the poster's seeming neutrality, the symbols comment on the contrast between the host city's religious past and devoutly secular present, an artistic freedom not afforded to Soviet designers of the time. Jeffrey Rugglas's Moscow 22nd Olympiad 1980, which received an honorable mention at the 1979 poster competition, shows a more dynamic composition common to contemporary design trends in sport. The depiction of the sportsman differs from the illustrative style seen in Soviet posters, as Rugglas has stylized only the colors of the figure rather than manipulating the form. This stylization shows the speed of the figure, grounding it to the competition elements of the game instead of dealing with metaphors that serve a larger narrative of ideology or lightness. The Olympic rings with the O in the title play. However, the poster lacks any specific design elements that could tie it to the 22nd Games, instead dealing with the concretes of strength and speed. This can be seen at odds with the generality of lightness seen in the Soviet approach to poster design. The role of lightness within the pleasure zone is integral when creating a space for states to appear as apolitical. However, it is not necessarily about falsities, but rather telling half-truths in order for such an event to take place regardless of hostility. Literal portrayals are the antithesis of the pleasure zone in that they can reveal a side of the initiator that is contrary to how they are endeavoring to present themselves. The adherence to lightness gave way to oddities in the designs presented by the Soviets, which drew attention to the existence of the pleasure zone characteristics throughout the rest of the event. The international designers who participated in the poster competition, although advised on the theme of friendship, were not under the same ideological constraints as the Soviets to adhere to it graphically, instead being critiqued as outsiders. The adoption of friendship as theme dictated the imagery of Olympic posters for the Moscow 22nd Games and became the primary vehicle for achieving lightness in the creation of the pleasure zone. When hosting an Olympics, heightened symbolism exists within the graphic language to communicate both metaphorically and in literal ways, used ultimately to contribute to the creation of the pleasure zone. As symbols signify something other than themselves, when employed effectively, they can bring depth to design elements that can be seen to uphold the architecture of facade and affirm ideology. Furthermore, given the Olympics is a global and nomadic event, heightened symbolism is intrinsic to communicating in the absence of language. In the case of the 22nd Olympic Games in Moscow, assessing these symbols collectively reveals an image of the Soviet Union that is at odds with how it wished to be received by the states it was welcoming. The presentation and implementation of heightened symbolism in the 1980 Olympic Games was messy, mimetic, and overtly unsure of itself, undermining the facade that the graphic design was meant to champion. However, the fractured facade created the potential for an interpretation by the visitors that may have been truer to Soviet reality, a state attempting to sell its own unity whilst undergoing immense political change. In a practical sense, an Olympic Games can never completely cater to the diversity of its visitors. As it is a global and nomadic in nature, there is no single common language, and therefore language cannot be relied on as the central vehicle of communication. Instead, the host state makes use of symbols that have a literal correlation between signifier and signified. For example, Olympic pictograms, revised every 4 years by the host state, depict bodies participating in the event that is signified. The imagery created by bodies in motion is tied to the rules of the sport, rather than the conventions of language. This allows for their recognition through shapes instead of words. Its design has a duty to specific and factual communication, rather than ideals of the host state. Additionally, heightened symbolism can be used to visually reinforce the nominated metaphors of the host state and prompt a reading of benevolence from its visitors. As signs of the simplification of complex, it gives room for the state to present a sanitized version of itself within potentially hostile contexts. These symbols aid in the reframing of the political context into one that is neutral or ideally positive. While avoiding referencing it directly. In the case of the 22nd Olympic Games, the Soviet Union's task was to present itself as a socialist success story and a rival to the modern nations who would take part in the Games. To do this, the organizing committee opted to adopt features of modernist design. However, because the Soviet Union did not have a domestic history of modernism, the designs itself could merely signal the modern. Therefore, the designs come across as inauthentic or ungrounded. This approach to heightened symbolism can be better understood when we consider Gunther Kress's theory of social semiotics, as outlined in his 2009 book Multimodality. He continues, "If I want to be understood by preference, I use the resources that those around me know and use to make signs which I need to make. If I am not familiar with those resources, I make signs in which the form strongly suggests the meaning I want to communicate." Olympic Games design in the 1960s and 70s can be read as a cultural marker for visual trends in the Western world, seeing a close adherence to the theory of modernist design made by capitalist states. However, these trends in modernism were not exhibited within the Soviet Union's history to the same degree as neighboring nations. Instead, socialist realism remained the dominant genre in the visual arts by decree. In the decades preceding the death of Stalin, this style was incrementally cast aside, yet what emerged was a familiarity with modernism rather than a history of its practice. Due to this difference in the visual design history, Moscow's organizing committee could merely construct signs that strongly suggested the meaning based on around what it believed modernism to be. This resulted in an attempt that is highly mimetic of existing design. Furthermore, the organizing committee for games throughout the 1960s and 70s approached the immense task as they would creating a visual identity for corporate clients, similar to what could be described today as branding. What was developed was a singular strategy that had the ability to adapt across different materials while maintaining familiarity and continuity. The guidelines for logo applications were distributed publicly, and posters were sourced according to specific sport or thematic categories. This close adherence to the particulars when producing the look of the games resulted in an identity that was sharp and cohesive across a range of contexts. In the case of Moscow 1980 Olympic Games, instead of placing the whole commission to one studio, the organizing committee delegated the design and production of each piece of ephemera and merchandise to different organizations, as was common to the Soviet way of production. This approach lent itself to a focus on individual pieces of material, yet undermined visual continuity of the games, instead relying on phrases and the mascot to create a narrative and support ideology. The organizing committee, continuing to signal the modern, commissioned Soviet-type designers A. Muzanov and V. Kobrin to design Cyrillic typeface Futuro Medium, reminiscent of the infamous Futura designed by Paul Renner. At the time, Typefaces in the Soviet Union were few and tightly regulated. This fueled a culture of bootlegging that sought to create Cyrillic versions of popular typefaces. Futuro, despite being commissioned by the state, appeared to be no exception to this culture, as it remains unclear if the Cyrillic version was authorized or even recognized outside of the Union. Furthermore, the typeface was applied haphazardly across different Olympic printed material, to the point where, despite being the official typeface, it was only uniformly applied when accompanying the emblem. Instead, when it came to the publishing of official materials, printing houses opted for existing typefaces from Soviet foundries. This undermined the desired effect of creating a specific front for the 22nd Games. This failure to use Futuro consistently can be seen on the tickets designed for the Moscow Games, as well as serving as an example of the organizing committee's understanding of modernism. The tickets presented a design that appears unsure of itself, yet familiar. The Moscow tickets are reminiscent of the design implemented by Montreal Olympic Committee in 1976, but lack the logic that underpinned Montreal's modular design. Montreal utilized columns to logically group specific kinds of information. However, when a column system was used in Moscow's tickets, the flow of information was disjointed. The 22nd Games logo type sits in a similar place to Montreal's, held by a white square instead of inverted to sit within the composition, making it appear heavy yet unassertive. Moscow's organizing committee stressed the importance of the ticket living on as a souvenir. However, due to the position of the bend line, the headline text would be severed when used. In the application of modernist aesthetics, the reasoning behind them was lost, which resulted in a design that appears as a bootleg. The organizing committee mobilized heightened symbolism to encourage a view of the Soviet Union as a modern state at the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. However, due to their signaling of modernism without a modernist approach to the design process, the look of the Games lacked cohesion across various materials. This fractured presentation can be considered to undermine the architecture facade within the pleasure zone. However, it did not culminate in a failure of visual identity. Rather, it allowed for a reading of domestic conditions that may have been the truest to reality, despite being at odds with the state's intentions. Graphic design required in the Olympic legacy calls on designers to summarize or minimize a state's nuances and cultural complexities into a visual identity that is cohesive and palatable at a global level. States adopt pleasure zone characteristics to manufacture a facade that attempts to gloss over geopolitical realities. The existence of this facade only becomes apparent when a fractured front is presented, allowing for a reading of reality which is at odds with the one championed. The Moscow 1980 Summer Olympic Games took place in a highly conflictual political environment, hosted by a state on the brink of collapse. The organizing committee relied on the mascot instead of developing a more nuanced design system to ensure the oasis in a perhaps hostile context, a crutch that was mocked by critics. The posters created for the event observed lightness through the theme of friendship, which gave way to oddities in their design, such as the mixing of graphic styles from a range of time periods. The organizing committee's use of heightened symbolism to encourage the USSR's reception as a modern state was curbed by their lack of a coherent system. Despite undermining the pleasure zone's facade, hindsight shows that this display may have been the most authentic, considering that the event took place only a decade before the state's own closing ceremony.
На трибунах становится тише, душе тает быстрое время чудес. До свидания, наш ласковый Миша, возвращайся в свой сказочный лес. Не грусти, улыбнись на прощание, вспоминай эти дни, вспоминай. Пожелай исполнения желаний, новой встречи нам всем пожелай.